The grease was already popping before she reached for the flour. You could hear that cast iron singing from the next room, and the smell of cornmeal hitting hot lard meant supper was close. Those kitchens are gone now. Here are 30 easy 1930s meals our grandparents ate to survive that have disappeared. Cornbread crumbled in cold buttermilk was the meal that needed no stove, no reheating, and no explanation if you came from the right kitchen. You baked it in a cast iron skillet greased with lard, and if you were from the South, you left the sugar out entirely. Appalachian cooks used no leavening at all, just ground corn, hot water, and rendered fat, pressed flat and cooked until the edges cracked. That night or the next morning, you broke the cold bread into a tall glass, poured buttermilk over it, and ate it with a spoon. The tangy milk softened the crumble into something almost creamy. Every household had their own way. Some added salt, others a drizzle of sorghum, and a northern version might have honey stirred in. That one difference could tell you exactly where someone came from. You never asked for the recipe. You watched, and you remembered. Water-based potato soup kept more households alive during the Depression than almost anything else on this list. Not the creamy, loaded kind you see now. This was potatoes, water, salt, a little pepper, and an onion if you had one. You peeled thin to save every scrap, and as the potatoes boiled down, the starch thickened the broth into something that felt heavier than it was. No milk, no cream, no butter in the worst months. Just water and whatever came out of the root cellar. Mothers stretched it across 2 days by adding more water and a handful of dried beans or a leftover heel of bread. Potatoes were cheap to grow, cheap to store, and forgiving enough to survive a bad season in a dark basement corner. Kids ate it without complaint because there was nothing else. Years later, grown men and women would describe that thin, peppery broth as if it were the finest thing they ever tasted. Not because it was, but because of who was standing at the stove. Sugar bread cost almost nothing and meant the world to a child who had never tasted store-bought candy. A slice of bread, a thin layer of butter or lard, and a spoonful of white sugar pressed into the fat before it melted. Some added cinnamon if they had it. Most did not. You folded it in half and ate it standing up, and the crunch of sugar against soft bread was the closest thing to dessert in a house where dessert did not exist. White sugar sold for about 5 cents a pound, and even in the hardest months, most pantries kept a small sack. Kids came home from school and made it themselves. No oven, no mixing, no waiting. Open-faced was the proper way, but hungry little ones folded it because it held together better in small hands. When you try to explain it to someone who did not grow up that way, they hear poverty. You hear love measured in a teaspoon. She started it the night before. Always the night before. Fried cornmeal mush began with boiling cornmeal and water with a pinch of salt until it thickened into a paste too heavy to stir easily, then pouring it into a loaf pan and setting it in the icebox overnight. By morning, it had firmed into a solid block you could slice like bread. Each slab went into a skillet of bacon grease or lard and fried until both sides turned golden and the edges went crisp. Inside, it stayed soft and warm, and you ate it with sorghum syrup or molasses poured right over the top. Some called it fried mush, some called it hoe cakes, and in parts of Appalachia, it was simply breakfast for months at a time. Cornmeal cost pennies, and one batch fed a household of 6. The Pennsylvania Dutch had a cousin called scrapple, cornmeal mush packed with ground pork scraps and sage, sliced and fried the same way. The ones who knew never measured. They poured cornmeal into boiling water by feel, watching the color, and knew it was done by the way it pulled from the side of the pot. Before the skillet cooled from that morning's mush, something even simpler was already cooking. Bean cakes happened when you had a pot of leftover beans and not much else. You mashed them, navy, pinto, black-eyed, whatever was on hand, mixed them with a handful of flour, shaped them into flat patties, and fried them in lard until a crust formed. By 1932, a bag of dried beans cost nearly nothing, and they needed no refrigeration. Yesterday's mushy leftovers became something crisp, hot, and filling enough to call dinner. People who could not afford meat ate them 3 or 4 times a week. The ones who seasoned them best added diced onion, a heavy shake of black pepper, and a scrape of bacon grease from the jar on the counter that gave them a smoky richness. Hoover stew carried the name of the president nobody wanted to credit for anything. When Herbert Hoover took office just before the crash of 1929, his name got attached to every symbol of failure. The shantytowns were Hoovervilles. The empty pockets turned inside out were Hoover flags, and the stew made from scraps was Hoover stew. The recipe used macaroni, canned tomatoes, and sliced hot dogs simmered in one pot, sometimes with canned corn or beans added. People in shanty camps near railroad yards cooked it over open fires, and it fed a dozen from a single pot if you added enough water. The trick was dropping the macaroni in last so it did not turn to paste and slicing the hot dogs thin so every bowl got some. It was the kind of meal nobody asked for twice, but everybody ate without a word. You did not complain. Complaining meant you had options, and in those years, options were the first thing to disappear. Milk toast went by different names depending on the house, and in some places they called it graveyard stew, a name dark enough to match the times. You toasted a slice of bread, set it in a bowl, sprinkled it with sugar and cinnamon, then poured warm milk over the top until the bread softened into something between soup and porridge. It was the food of sick days and empty pantries, the meal mothers made when nothing was left but bread and milk, and the will to put something warm in front of a child. The bread had to be homemade and thick enough to hold its shape for a few bites. Store-bought dissolved too fast. Some used salt and butter instead of sugar, making it savory. In the hardest months, when milk ran out, mothers poured leftover coffee over stale toast and called it the same thing. German households had their own version, Milchbrot, handed down from the old country and eaten the same way their grandmothers had served it in Bavaria. You ate it without looking up. It was just the sound of a spoon against a bowl and the quiet proof that someone was still trying. Dandelion greens came from the yard, the ditch, the empty lot. Anywhere the yellow flowers pushed through dirt. They were free, and during the Depression, free was its own food group. Italian immigrant households sautéed them with olive oil and garlic, and that simple habit kept them among the healthiest communities in the country during the worst years. Southern and Appalachian cooks boiled the greens 3 separate times in fresh water to draw out the bitterness, then dressed them with hot bacon grease and a splash of vinegar. The trick was picking them young, before the leaves turned tough. You went early in the morning when the dew was still on them, and kids learned to spot the jagged leaves from across the yard. Rich in iron and vitamins, dandelions kept people from malnutrition when grocery shelves sat empty and gardens had failed. Navy bean soup simmered for hours and filled a house with the kind of smell that made you think everything might turn out fine. The beans, small, white, dense, were a staple of government relief programs, distributed in bulk because they cost almost nothing, carried real protein, and lasted months in a dry pantry without refrigeration. You soaked them overnight, then cooked them low and slow with whatever pork you had, a ham hock, a chunk of salt pork, a few strips of bacon already used once for grease. The fat rendered into the broth and turned plain water into something rich and smoky. Onions went in early. A carrot or celery went in too if you had them, but the soup worked without either. Boston cooks baked their beans with blackstrap molasses and a streak of mustard and called it something else, but the bones of the recipe were the same: beans, water, thyme, and scraps of pork. The dish got its name from U.S. Navy mess halls where it had been served since the early 1900s. One pot fed a household for 2 days, and by the third it was more broth than bean, stretched thin with a torn piece of bread. Hot water cornbread needed no oven, no eggs, and no milk, just cornmeal, boiling water, salt, and hands tough enough to shape the dough while it was still hot. You poured boiling water over the cornmeal and stirred fast, then scooped the mixture and patted it between your palms into flat rounds the size of your hand. Each patty went into a skillet of hot lard and fried until the outside turned dark gold and the inside stayed dense and steaming. The sound told you when the grease was right. A hard sizzle meant go, and if it popped too loud, you pulled back and waited. In rural homes across the South during the 1930s, these showed up at every meal, with beans, with greens, with gravy, or alone. The shaping was everything. Too thick and the center stayed raw, too thin and they fell apart. Your hands just knew. If those cornbread patties carried people through the afternoon, tomato gravy and biscuits carried them through winter. The gravy started with bacon grease scraped from the jar every kitchen kept near the stove. You heated it in a skillet, stirred in flour until it browned, then added canned tomatoes or fresh ones from the garden, crushing them by hand as they hit the hot fat. It cooked down thick and tangy, somewhere between a sauce and a stew, and you ladled it over biscuits split open and still steaming. The biscuits were cathead style in the South, big as a cat's head, made with flour, lard, and buttermilk, patted by hand instead of rolled. A dash of hot sauce was the mark of a cook who knew what she was doing. The tomatoes came from the canning jars lined up in the cellar, and by late winter those jars were running low and the gravy got thinner. You ate it anyway. You ate it because she made it, and because nothing on a cold morning tasted more like being cared for. Vinegar pie proved you could fool a tongue into believing almost anything if you understood the chemistry. When lemons cost more than a day's wages and fresh fruit had vanished, cooks reached for the one tangy ingredient every pantry still held: a bottle of plain vinegar. Mixed with sugar, a few eggs, a tablespoon of flour, and a small knob of butter, the filling baked into something custardy and tart enough to pass for lemon pie if nobody asked questions. The recipe dates to the 1800s, but it surged during the 1930s when substitution became survival. People across the Midwest and South called these desperation pies and served them at church suppers without apology. The crust was lard-based, rolled thin, and crimped by hand. You set it on the table and watched someone take a bite, pause, and try to name what they were tasting. They expected nothing. They got something worth finishing. Creamed peas on toast showed up in WPA cooking pamphlets distributed to struggling households across the country. Government-printed cards that taught women how to feed a table on almost nothing. The recipe was as plain as it sounds. You made a white sauce from butter, flour, and milk, stirred in a can of peas, heated it through, and poured it over toast. That was the whole meal. The pamphlets promoted it as economical and high-calorie, which was a polite way of saying it was cheap and filling and nobody was expected to enjoy it. But people did. The warmth of the sauce, the soft bread underneath soaking up the cream, the small sweetness of the peas. It added up to something that felt like a real supper even when the cupboard said otherwise. Mothers served it on the nights between payday and payday, and kids grew up thinking it was a regular dish, not a sign that the money had run out. The ones who made it well added a pinch of black pepper and a scrape of onion. The ones who made it with love served it without apology. Clara Canucciari was 91 years old when she showed the world how to make poor man's meal on YouTube, and the video has been watched millions of times since. She peeled and cubed potatoes, fried them halfway in a hot skillet, added chopped onion, then tossed in sliced hot dogs and a splash of tomato sauce. That was it. She talked while she cooked, about quitting high school because her people could not afford socks, about stretching a $1 sack of potatoes across a week, about her mother making something from nothing every single night. The dish resembled a cross between hash and fried latkes, and it cost almost nothing to make. Hot dogs were among the cheapest sources of protein available in the 1930s, and potatoes filled stomachs faster than anything else in the pantry. Clara made it look easy, and maybe it was. But what made you watch the video twice was not the recipe. It was her. The way she moved through that kitchen like the Depression had never ended, like waste was still a sin, like every potato still mattered. She passed away in 2013. The recipe survived. She did not. If Clara's potatoes fed a generation one skillet at a time, the next one fed them from a single loaf pan. Peanut butter bread appeared in the 1932 Five Roses flour cookbook out of Canada, and it solved a problem most bakers thought was impossible: how to make bread without eggs, butter, or yeast. The recipe used just 6 ingredients: flour, sugar, baking powder, salt, milk, and peanut butter. The peanut butter provided the fat and the protein, the baking powder handled the rise, and the whole thing went from bowl to oven in under 10 minutes. It came out dense and golden with a subtle nutty sweetness that tasted like a peanut butter cookie in bread form. During the worst years of the Depression, when yeast was scarce and eggs cost more than most could spare, this bread kept showing up on tables because every ingredient could sit in a pantry for months. You sliced it thick and ate it plain, or spread more peanut butter on top if you had it. Nobody called it fancy. Nobody needed to. You never told the kids what was in it. That was the rule. Oatmeal stretched hamburger was the quiet trick of every mother who needed a pound of ground beef to feed 6 or 7 mouths. You mixed the meat with a cup of dry oats, a beaten egg if you had one, diced onion, salt, and pepper, then shaped it into patties or packed it into a loaf pan. The oats absorbed the fat as it cooked and swelled to nearly double, turning 1 pound into something that looked and felt like 2. Breadcrumbs worked the same way, and some cooks used mashed beans or crumbled stale bread, but oats held together best and disappeared into the meat so completely that nobody could tell. The arguments came later, decades later, when grown sons and daughters found out what had been in their mother's meatloaf all along. Some laughed, some felt tricked. Most just went quiet, understanding for the first time what it had cost her to make sure every plate was full. Nobody believed it until they tasted it. Mayonnaise cake sounded wrong in every way. A chocolate cake with a full cup of mayonnaise stirred into the batter. But the chemistry was simple. Mayonnaise is oil and eggs already emulsified, so it replaced both ingredients in a single scoop. During the 1930s, when eggs and butter were expensive and oil was not, a jar of mayo stretched further than either one. The cake came out moist and rich, with a crumb so tender it barely held together on the fork. You could not taste the mayonnaise at all. That was the secret, and the women who made it kept that secret for years, serving it at church potlucks and holiday tables without ever revealing the ingredient that made it work. The recipe spread through handwritten cards passed between neighbors and clipped from newspaper columns. One version, found in a Depression-era cookbook, called for mayo, sugar, cocoa, flour, and vanilla. Nothing else. It tasted like the kind of chocolate cake that should have cost real money. It did not. Before the sun came up, the pot was already on the stove. Cornmeal porridge was breakfast in the truest sense, the meal that got a household moving when there was nothing else to start the day. You boiled water, stirred in cornmeal and a pinch of salt, and cooked it until it thickened into a smooth, heavy paste. Served hot with milk poured over the top and a drizzle of sorghum or maple syrup, it sat in your stomach like a stone and kept you full until noon. Oatmeal got the credit in history books, but cornmeal was cheaper and more available, especially in the South and across the Dust Bowl states where corn still grew when wheat had failed. Some mornings there was no milk and no syrup, and you ate it plain with just salt and a spoonful of lard stirred in for richness. The woman who made it was usually up an hour before anyone else, standing at the stove in the dark, stirring a pot she had stirred 1,000 mornings before. You did not thank her enough. Nobody did. Nothing got thrown away, not in those kitchens. Potato pancakes were what happened to yesterday's leftover mashed potatoes when a woman who had survived the Depression got hold of them. You mixed the cold potatoes with a beaten egg, a handful of flour, salt, pepper, and diced onion, shaped them into flat rounds, and fried them in lard or bacon grease until the outside went golden and crisp. The inside stayed creamy and soft, and the contrast was the whole point. European immigrants, Polish, German, Irish, brought their own versions, and in Appalachian kitchens the recipe was almost identical to the latkes served in Jewish households across the Northeast. The technique was the same everywhere: leftover starch, a binding agent, hot fat, and patience. You flipped them only once. Touching them too early meant they stuck and fell apart. The ones who grew up making them could feel when the bottom had set just by the way the pan sounded. Mock apple pie is the single most audacious act of substitution in American cooking history. When apples were scarce and orchards had failed in the Dust Bowl drought, someone, nobody knows exactly who, discovered that soda crackers soaked in a syrup of water, sugar, cream of tartar, cinnamon, and lemon juice tasted almost exactly like apple filling. The concept dates to the 1800s, but it became famous during the 1930s when Nabisco printed the recipe on the back of every Ritz cracker box. The cream of tartar provided the tartness, The cinnamon gave it warmth, and the crackers softened into something with the texture and bite of cooked apple slices. Baked in a lard crust with dots of butter on top, it came out golden and bubbling, and the first bite genuinely confused people. The settlement cookbook, revised through the 30s, included its own version. Church suppers served it without apology. Guests asked for seconds without knowing what they were eating, and nobody told them until the pie was gone. No eggs, no butter, no milk. Wacky Cake broke every rule of baking and still came out of the oven soft, moist, and deeply chocolate. The recipe used flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, salt, vanilla, vegetable oil, vinegar, and water. Nothing else. The vinegar and baking soda created the chemical reaction that made it rise, replacing the eggs entirely, and the oil stood in for butter. The whole thing mixed in the pan itself. You made 3 wells in the dry ingredients, poured the wet ones in, stirred, and baked. Some called it crazy cake, some called it depression cake, and during the Second World War it came back again when rationing pulled eggs and butter off the shelves a second time. It was accidentally vegan decades before that word meant anything to most cooks. The women who made it understood chemistry better than anyone gave them credit for. They just called it making do. Why throw away bread that had gone stale when you could turn it into dessert? Bread pudding answered that question in every kitchen where waste was not an option. You tore the old bread into pieces, soaked it in a mixture of milk, eggs, sugar, and vanilla until it softened, then baked it until the top turned golden and the inside set into a warm, custardy mass. Cinnamon went in if you had it, raisins too, if the pantry was generous. The bread could be days old, hard, dry, nearly inedible on its own, and the pudding made it new again. That transformation was the whole point. Stale bread cost nothing, eggs and milk were cheap, and the result tasted rich enough to serve company. Mothers who scraped every crust into a bowl all week baked the pudding on Sunday, and what had been the scraps of 6 days became the centerpiece of the 7th. Today, it shows up on restaurant menus at $15 a plate. Back then, it was the last stop before the trash turned into something worth saving. Water, sugar, flour, butter, vanilla, and a pie crust. That was the entire recipe for water pie, and nobody who heard it believed it would work. You sprinkled flour across the bottom of an unbaked shell, poured in a cup of sugar dissolved in water, dotted the surface with butter shavings, added vanilla, and set it in the oven. The flour and sugar thickened the water into a translucent, wobbly custard that set firm enough to slice. It tasted faintly sweet, slightly buttery, and nothing like the empty promise its name suggested. People called it hard times pie, and it belonged to a whole family of Desperation desserts that proved a woman with an oven and 5 cents worth of ingredients could still put something worth eating on the table. The women who invented these recipes understood chemistry they never got credit for. Heat and starch and sugar turning plain water into something that held its shape and satisfied a craving. Nobody remembers their names. Everybody ate their pies. Cabbage lasted for months without refrigeration, and that single fact made it the most important vegetable of the Depression. Cabbage soup started with a head of cabbage, a pot of water, and whatever else the kitchen could spare: an onion, a potato, a carrot, a handful of dried beans. You chopped it rough, dropped it all in, and let it simmer until the house smelled like something was cooking, even when the pot held almost nothing of real substance. The soup stretched across an entire week in some households. Monday, it was thick with vegetables. By Friday, it was mostly broth, reheated and thinned with water, with a heel of bread torn into the bowl to fill the gap. Church ladies brought pots of it to neighbors who had less, and in mining towns across Kentucky and West Virginia, cabbage soup was sometimes the only hot meal a family saw for days at a time. The kids who grew up on it never forgot the smell, sweet and sulfurous, filling the kitchen before school, still hanging in the air when they came home. Some cannot stand cabbage to this day. Others make the soup every winter and never explain why. If cabbage soup belonged to the kitchens, mulligan stew belonged to the road. It was born in the hobo camps along the railroad tracks, Clusters of men and sometimes whole families living in makeshift shelters, pooling whatever food they had into a single pot over an open fire. Everyone contributed. One man brought a potato, another had an onion. Someone had a can of beans or a scrap of salt pork. The pot simmered all day and fed whoever showed up, and the taste changed every night. Some versions were thick with vegetables and meat. Others were thin enough to see through. In the worst camps, people added sawdust to give the broth body, because an empty pot meant nobody slept well. The name came from the Irish, and the tradition went back decades, but it was the 1930s that turned it into a symbol of what happens when people with nothing find a way to feed each other. Those fires went out a long time ago. The men who sat around them are gone. It could not have been simpler. Rice in warm milk with sugar and cinnamon was the meal that asked nothing of the cook and gave everything to the child who ate it. You heated milk, stirred in leftover rice, added sugar and cinnamon, and served it warm. That was supper. That was sometimes the only supper. German mothers called it Milchreis mit Zucker and served it the way their own mothers had in the old country. Southern households poured it cold over day-old rice in summer and called it dessert. The rice stretched the milk, the sugar made it sweet, and the cinnamon made it feel like someone had tried. Kids ate it and went to bed full, and the taste of warm rice and milk became the flavor of being small and safe and fed when the world outside was none of those things. You cannot buy that taste. You can only remember it, standing in your own kitchen decades later, stirring a pot that will never taste the way hers did. A can of Campbell's tomato soup went into the batter, and the cake tasted like Christmas. Tomato soup cake was the trick that sounded impossible until you took a bite. The soup replaced milk and buttermilk, adding moisture and a faint tang that vanished beneath cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and allspice. The result was a warm, dense, fragrant cake that tasted like something from a bakery, not a kitchen running on fumes. Poet Sylvia Plath grew up during the later years of the Depression and made it herself, later writing to her mother from England asking about the size of American soup cans because her version came out too wet. Campbell's had 5 flavors by the end of the 30s and advertised on radio and streetcars, but it was home cooks who discovered a 10-cent can could serve as the secret ingredient in a cake nobody would guess. The recipe passed through handwritten cards and newspaper clippings, always with the same rule. Do not tell them what is in it until they ask for seconds. Eleanor Roosevelt served prune pudding at the White House, and the press never let her forget it. She had consulted with scientists at Cornell University to develop cheap, filling recipes for struggling households, and prune pudding topped the list. Boiled prunes, sugar, and cornstarch, sometimes with lemon or cinnamon, set into a soft, dark dessert that looked worse than it tasted. Prunes stored for months without refrigeration and cost far less than fresh fruit. The president ate the pudding without complaint, and the White House served modest meals throughout the Depression as a quiet act of solidarity. 7.5-cent lunches of deviled eggs, mashed potatoes, and coffee. The pudding became a newspaper joke, but in kitchens across the country, mothers made their own versions without knowing the First Lady ate the same thing. That connection, the shared table between a president's wife and a coal miner's, said more about those years than any headline ever printed. They called it SOS, and the S did not stand for soup. Creamed chipped beef on toast earned its nickname Honestly. Salty, gray, and ladled over bread that soldiers and civilians ate with the grim determination of people who had no other choice. The dish came from Pennsylvania Dutch country, where dried salted beef had been a pantry staple for generations. You shredded the beef, made a roux from butter and flour, whisked in milk, stirred in the meat, and poured the whole thing over toast. The military adopted it in the First World War and kept it through the Second, and by the 1930s it had moved from mess halls into home kitchens because dried beef was cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with protein. Veterans ate it at home and cursed it the way they had in the barracks. Their wives made it because the ingredients cost almost nothing. The kids ate it because the plate held nothing else. When there was nothing left, no beans, no potatoes, no eggs, no canned anything, there was lard on bread. Large sandwiches sat at the very bottom of the Depression pantry, the meal that waited when every other option had been used up. You spread a thick layer of rendered pork fat on a slice of bread, added salt if you had it, and ate it standing at the counter because sitting down felt too much like giving up. Some used bacon grease from the jar near the stove, and the faint smokiness made it almost bearable. Others ate it plain, white fat on white bread, and did not look at anyone while they chewed. It was not a recipe, it was the absence of one. But it kept you alive another day, and in the winter of 1933, when a quarter of the country was out of work, another day was all anyone was asking for. The women who served this to their own kids carried that quietly for the rest of their lives. They never had to explain. The ones who ate it already knew. In tough economic times, resourcefulness often triumphed over squeamishness, and few dishes captured this gritty ingenuity better than the infamous roadkill stew. During the Great Depression, families faced with empty pantries saw opportunity in freshly struck animals, deer, rabbits, raccoons, lying roadside, turning these unfortunate encounters into nourishing meals. After inspection, mostly visual, food safety rules were looser back then, the carcasses were quickly skinned, cleaned, and tossed into pots bubbling with potatoes, onions, carrots, and herbs. Cookbooks from the 1930s humorously cautioned cooks to select only recently deceased creatures, advising that tire tracks were a less than ideal seasoning. Surprisingly, this improvised delicacy wasn't just rural folklore. City folks, too, adopted roadkill recipes as an economical alternative to expensive butcher shop meat. Today, however, collecting roadside meals has moved from economical practicality to legal controversy. Many states now strictly regulate or outright forbid harvesting roadkill, citing health hazards from bacteria, parasites, and unknown diseases, not to mention wildlife preservation laws designed to prevent poaching disguised as scavenging. Now, you've heard of lots of kinds of different sandwiches, but a bean sandwich might be new even for us. What does it typically consist of? Well, you basically treat the beans as a spread here. The cooked beans often get mashed, and then they're mixed with seasonings and herbs to add a bit of an aromatic kick to them. Typically, people were using regional beans that were really easy to get. You know as well as I do that convenience runs in the blood of every American, my friend. Pinto beans, navy beans, and kidney beans were some of the most accessible kinds of beans around and were the easiest to get. Lots of hardship economically meant that people had no option but to rely on things like these for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but particularly breakfast. With lunch and dinner, you could still run a soup or some kind of stew and get away with it. But what did people do for breakfast? Butter and toast? Couldn't have worked. You were saving that bread for more filling options, and butter was expensive. Things like bean sandwiches were really helpful because they were a reliable go-to breakfast option that also had a lot of health benefits like protein and fiber. Bread bag ironing solved the problem of wrinkled clothes without expensive spray starch or steam irons. Families saved waxed paper bags from store-bought bread, using them as pressing cloths when ironing delicate fabrics. The slight wax coating prevented scorching while allowing heat to smooth wrinkles. More importantly, families learned to dampen clothes by sprinkling them with water, rolling them tightly, then storing them inside bread bags overnight. The sealed environment allowed moisture to distribute evenly throughout fabric, making ironing faster the next morning. Children often helped with sprinkling and rolling, learning household skills serving them throughout their lives. Some women sprinkled clothes Saturday night, letting them sit until Monday's ironing session. The bread bags were reused dozens of times before wearing out. This hack exemplified the Depression-era mindset that nothing should serve only one purpose when creativity could multiply value. When food budgets shrank dramatically in Depression-era America, backyard creatures found themselves promoted from pests to pot roast. Among these unlikely dinner guests was the humble opossum, famously cooked into dishes such as opossum pot roast. Preparation involved meticulous attention, first soaking the meat overnight in salted water, then carefully removing excess fat before slowly roasting alongside sweet potatoes, onions, carrots, and apples. Cookbooks from that time proudly featured detailed opossum recipes. reassuring skeptical home chefs that the meat was tender, mild-flavored, and almost as good as pork, though likely no opossum ever felt flattered by the comparison. Historically significant in southern states, the opossum was even humorously honored at community possum suppers, where neighbors gathered, possibly wondering if dinner had recently visited their own porch. However, modern dining etiquette and strict wildlife regulations have largely removed opossum from American menus. Health officials today strongly advise against eating opossums due to risks of diseases like leptospirosis and parasites unaffected by standard cooking temperatures. Many states now regulate or ban trapping and consumption of these marsupials altogether, highlighting safety concerns over nostalgia. Fried bologna hash was a classic dish that got a lot of traction out of the middle of the 20th century. The dish was basically something that was insanely available in terms of ingredients. Bologna was a really easy-to-get processed meat, and it was often sold in these decently sized packages. It's always such a blessing when the company decides to, not skim off the top and actually give you a pretty generous package. Plus, bologna was quick, really quick. You opened the package it came in, then you just put in the rest of the stuff. Now, back then, people were mostly just relying on crops and vegetables they had grown on their own through their backyard gardens and rationing efforts. One of these was potatoes, which was honestly such a lifesaver. Onions were also something people added occasionally. As for the bologna itself, people would usually fry that until it was decently caramelized, and then they'd mix it in with potatoes for a starchy and savory aftertaste. The hash was something that people served on its own, or sometimes with, like, a fried egg. It really helped to add basic things like that because you were always getting less protein than you ideally should have. Dandelion coffee became the morning ritual for families who could no longer afford real coffee beans during the Depression's worst years. The process began by digging dandelion roots from yards and fields, plants growing everywhere without cost. These roots were scrubbed clean, chopped into small pieces, and roasted slowly in cast iron pans until dark brown and brittle. Ground into powder using hand mills or pounded between stones, the roasted roots produced a surprisingly rich, earthy brew when steeped in boiling water. The taste carried hints of coffee's bitterness without caffeine, providing comfort on cold mornings when real coffee remained a distant luxury. Children often helped with harvesting, learning to identify the jagged leaves and deep taproots making the best substitute. Some families mixed dandelion with chicory root for deeper flavor. This hack kept morning traditions alive when store shelves might as well have been empty. Preserving meat was crucial when refrigeration wasn't an option, so Depression-era families turned to unpasteurized home-canned meats, a kitchen practice that involved cooking meat cuts, placing them in reused glass jars, then sealing tightly with wax or rudimentary lids. Housewives proudly displayed pantry shelves stocked with jars filled with pork, beef, or chicken simmered simply in their own juices, offering a reliable meal source during the harshest months. Although economical, this preservation method was essentially playing culinary roulette. Without pressure cookers, botulism thrived unseen, sometimes delivering more than families bargained for at dinner. After all, homemade pickles were tasty, paralysis not so much. In fact, botulism outbreaks from improperly canned meats contributed significantly to the establishment of strict federal regulations mandating pressure canning and pasteurization to safeguard consumers. By mid-century, labels, expiration dates, and government oversight replaced wax seals and guesswork, legally forbidding unpasteurized home-canned meats from commercial sale and strongly discouraging them domestically. Crackling cornbread is a pretty traditional Southern dish that comes right out of the family cookbooks of this decade, so that should tell you something about how much grandmas loved it. Crackling cornbread sounds a lot more climactic than it really is, though, so let's go through what makes it so crackling. Basically, they're made with chicharrones, or otherwise known as pork cracklings. These are crispy fried bits of fat that were rendered when the pork was being cooked, and they most typically come from the fatback or the skin of a pig. Now, one bit of time-specific context that's really important here is that people were using every part of the pig they could back then. Crackling cornbread was another variation of that kind of mentality where people really wanted to not let anything go to waste. especially the pig. Why was the pig so special, though? Well, unlike chickens, ducks, and even beef, the pig was the only animal that had use outside of the plate, too. You could use its bones for broths, you could use its fat for cooking, you could get lard out of it. That's what made this animal so important. And that's why so many dishes like crackling cornbread came out of the South when pigs were commonly being consumed due to the shortage of other options. Potato water starch gave families crisp, pressed clothing without spending money on commercial products. After boiling potatoes for dinner, the cloudy cooking water was saved and strained into jars. This starchy liquid, sprinkled onto fabric before ironing, created the same crisp finish that expensive store-bought starch provided. Shirts emerged with sharp collars, dresses with structured pleats, and tablecloths with professional crispness. The technique required practice. Too much potato water left fabric stiff, while too little failed to provide adequate body. Women learned to test concentration by feel, adjusting based on the weight of different fabrics. Some families kept potato water in ice boxes, though most used it fresh within a day before it soured. Sunday mornings often began with the smell of heated irons pressing starch into church clothes. This hack represented determination to maintain dignity even when poverty threatened to strip away pride. When desperation tightened its grip in the Great Depression, even the backyard robins and sparrows became fair game. Commonly known as songbirds, these feathered neighbors found themselves starring unwillingly in Depression-era dishes. Families employed homemade snares, nets, and carefully aimed slingshots to secure their tiny meals. Once captured, the birds, typically robins, sparrows, or blackbirds, were plucked, gutted, and roasted whole over open fires or baked with potatoes and onions into miniature pies. Interestingly, a 1930s household recipe even recommended skewering songbirds, seasoning lightly, and cooking rapidly, likely the original, less glamorous predecessor to today's fancy hors d'oeuvres. But this culinary trend, born purely of necessity rather than preference, soon faced heavy legal scrutiny. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act, established earlier but strictly enforced post-Depression, outlawed hunting, capturing, or consuming migratory songbirds to prevent their declining populations. Today, violating these regulations could result in hefty fines or even imprisonment, making songbird skewers a costly dish indeed. Have you ever heard about coffee soup? Sounds like a fever dream, right? Yet that's exactly what it is. A soup made with coffee. As offensive to your familiar taste buds as that sounds, hear me out. You take some coffee, scraps of bread, and sometimes mineral or brown sugar and milk, and then you'd brew the coffee. Then you'd mix in those pieces of bread in the hot coffee and add whatever sweeteners and spices you had, and that was pretty much that. They call it a soup, but in practice it's more like coffee with extra steps, really. Still, it was a far better use of your cup of joe than just drinking it plainly. This way, you could get carbs in the form of bread, some much-needed glucose from sugar to help keep your brain running, you got your daily hit of caffeine, and the spices would help keep you active. People didn't look at food the same way we did back then, which is why some of these dishes might seem really outlandish to you. We look at food and think about pleasure, fulfillment, and what suits our tastes. They'd look at food and think about sustenance and practicality. How much can we get out of this? What can we get out of this? That kind of thinking led to people trying things we'd never think of today. Flour sack clothing transformed humble cotton bags into dresses, shirts, curtains, and quilts that clothed entire families through the darkest Depression years. Manufacturers eventually printed colorful patterns on their sacks, knowing housewives chose brands based on fabric designs they could repurpose. Women purchased flour based on matching patterns, collecting enough sacks to create coordinated outfits. The cotton was surprisingly soft after washing, often more comfortable than store-bought fabric costing far more than families could afford. Grandmothers taught younger women to remove printed labels by soaking sacks in lye water, scrubbing until cotton emerged clean and ready for cutting. A single 100-pound flour sack yielded enough material for a child's dress or 2 dish towels. The stitching required skill, but seeing children clothed in bright fabric made the work worthwhile. This hack represented dignity maintained through creativity when everything else seemed to crumble. Back in the days when supermarket shelves weren't exactly overflowing with choices, families found protein wherever they could, even if that meant looking up into backyard trees for their next meal. Squirrel stew. Yes, these fluffy critters, nowadays famous mostly for raiding bird feeders, were often simmered slowly with root vegetables, onions, and herbs until tender. Considered lean, flavorful, and surprisingly nutritious, squirrels were not only abundant but a staple meat source when grocery money was scarce during the Depression. Interestingly, cookbooks from the era recommended soaking squirrel meat overnight in salt water or vinegar to reduce its distinctive gamey taste, resulting in something remarkably close to chicken, though Grandma probably never admitted it wasn't chicken when company came by. Modern laws recognize squirrels as protected game animals, closely regulated to ensure ecological balance and disease control. After all, nothing ruins nostalgia faster than discovering dinner might have rabies. Salt pork and milk gravy is something that was European, both in tradition and concept. You might wonder how something like that ends up on a list of the most popular things to eat when you have no money, right? Well, that has to do with how communal the country became during the Depression. You've only grown up hearing the phrase, "love thy neighbor." These people? They lived a traumatizing decade following that to the letter. See, many people had to reach out to the communities that were present in America and learn new ways of cooking, new recipes, and new ways to save costs and stretch supplies to last longer. That's how dishes like these started to become popular. The idea of salting your pork was something that people took to immediately because of how much it helped to preserve food, and this was doubly true for places that never ever had any source of preservation or where meat was hard to come by. Lots of people made do with the ingredients they had on hand, but as far as peasant food went, this was one of the more versatile and filling options to go for. Newspaper insulation was one of the most widespread survival hacks families used when winter winds cut through thin walls. Families collected old newspapers from neighbors and churches, stuffing them between wall studs, under floorboards, and inside attic spaces to create barriers against the cold. The layered paper trapped air pockets that slowed heat loss remarkably well. Children helped by crumpling sheets into tight balls that fit snugly into cracks around windows and doors. Some families even lined their clothing with newspaper, tucking pages inside coats and wrapping feet before sliding into worn shoes. The rustling sound of paper-lined garments became familiar in schoolrooms across rural America. What made this hack valuable was its complete lack of cost. Newspapers that would otherwise burn gained new life as thermal protection. Mothers taught daughters this technique. Knowing resourcefulness meant survival when coal ran short. If you've ever watched a raccoon tip over your garbage cans, you might find it hard to imagine inviting one to dinner. Yet, during the Great Depression, resourceful cooks did exactly that, preparing raccoon meat as routinely as chicken. Back then, hunting or trapping raccoons wasn't just a hobby, it was survival. Cookbooks advised carefully cleaning and soaking the meat overnight, typically in vinegar or salt water, to remove the greasy, gamey flavor before roasting it with sweet potatoes or simmering it into a hearty stew. Interestingly, raccoon was even featured prominently in community cook-offs and rural Sunday dinners, considered delicious enough to appear in popular recipes alongside pork and beef. However, the days of openly dining on raccoon meat faded with tightening health and wildlife regulations. Today, consuming raccoons is strongly discouraged or explicitly illegal in many states due to serious concerns about rabies and parasites. Wildlife agencies emphasize that raccoons, those nocturnal bandits once invited to dinner, carry diseases that cooking doesn't always eliminate. Another really popular thing to get around the time for breakfast was rye bread with lard spread. Now, lard spread was a pretty good way of using any kind of lard you had. Rye bread was also a pretty economical choice to go for because the average white bread was a little too expensive. Brown bread or rye bread were the kinds of options people were going for when they did their grocery shopping trips. Also, people who lived further away from places that were selling basic essentials and groceries also focused on rye bread for the fact that it would last longer. Little things like this really added up and made a difference in how people approached their shopping. One of the best uses of lard, outside of just using the fat for cooking, was to make a spread out of it. You might be thinking if that could really be so good, and I get where that thought comes from. Under normal, or let's say even typically bad circumstances? Probably not. It's nothing special, but in the 1930s, literally anything that added even a crumb of flavor to what you were eating was a godsend. Vinegar cleaning solutions replaced expensive commercial products throughout Depression-era households. A single bottle of white vinegar diluted with water-cleaned windows, cut grease, sanitized surfaces, removed stains, and deodorized everything from outhouses to kitchens. Adding salt created paste perfect for scrubbing copper pots until they gleamed. Mixed with baking soda, vinegar cleared clogged drains and scoured stubborn buildup from ovens. The sharp smell became synonymous with cleanliness, filling homes on Saturday cleaning days when families prepared for Sunday visitors. Women kept bottles of diluted vinegar, tackling spills immediately. The acid killed mold and mildew, particularly valuable in damp basements where moisture encouraged growth. Some families added dried herbs to vinegar bottles, creating pleasantly scented solutions costing virtually nothing. This hack proved that expensive products offered little advantage over simple chemistry applied with elbow grease. In an era when practicality trumped sentimentality, even the family pet wasn't always off-limits as a main course. Pet rabbits for meat became common during the Great Depression, as families raised them not just for fluffy companionship, but also as a convenient dinner solution. Surprisingly tender and mild-tasting, rabbit meat was commonly fried, stewed, or baked into pies after soaking overnight in buttermilk or vinegar to reduce gamminess. Because nothing ruins a Depression-era Sunday dinner quite like unwanted backyard flavor. Raising rabbits was uniquely economical, as these fluffy companions conveniently doubled as livestock, feeding on grass and garden scraps and multiplying at legendary speeds. There's a reason we still joke about rabbits' reproductive enthusiasm today. However, attitudes toward rabbits changed dramatically in post-war America. As people increasingly viewed these long-eared animals strictly as cuddly household companions rather than dinner options, cultural taboos strengthened significantly. Modern urban zoning regulations often explicitly forbid slaughtering animals considered pets, making it not just socially questionable but legally risky to prepare rabbit dinners at home in populated areas. So, the thing about lard biscuits was that it was essentially too available. Lard's pretty much just rendered pig fat, if you weren't familiar. Sometimes, people use cooking fat to add flavor and texture to a dish, and it helps to really make it an overall more filling meal. Now, since most of the urbanization hadn't taken place yet in America yet, and there were still loads of rural areas to go around, lard biscuits became very common. They were far more affordable than butter or oil, which is what you would usually use for your cooking if you had some spare change you didn't need to hold on to. It became such a common element of Southern cooking that it also eventually just became a tradition that people associated with the region. It's now a deeply ingrained part of American culture. Historically, biscuits were a big part of the way people lived in the South during hard times of the Depression. Leavening agents were really just the most worrisome part of the entire haul. You get baking powder and baking soda, which helps a lot in making the biscuits rise. You want your cookies fluffy, after all, not chewy and soggy. Now, the people would usually cut lard into the dry stuff, such as the flour and baking powder. Since flour was a rarity, most people used all-purpose flour. The rest was just the typical biscuit process, really. They're a lot better than you'd think, but they did cause lots of health issues over time, too. Cardboard shoe soles extended the life of worn footwear when replacement shoes were simply impossible to purchase. Families traced foot shapes onto sturdy cardboard from boxes, cutting precise insoles fitting inside shoes whose leather bottoms had worn through. Some households kept stacks of pre-cut insoles ready, knowing wet weather would dissolve one pair quickly. Children walked to school with cardboard between their feet and the ground, learning early that complaining changed nothing when resources were scarce. More skilled families layered cardboard with newspaper for durability, sometimes coating the bottom with melted wax for water resistance. The cardboard compressed throughout the day, requiring nightly replacement in many cases. What seemed like a temporary fix often became a permanent solution lasting months. This hack taught children that ingenuity could solve problems that money could not, a lesson shaping how an entire generation approached challenges. In Depression-era America, protein was at a premium, and butcher shops quietly began offering an unconventional choice to economically strained families: horse meat. Marketed discreetly as an affordable alternative to beef, horse meat steaks, sausages, and roasts made regular appearances on dinner tables. Recipes often called for marinating the meat overnight to tenderize its notoriously tougher texture, while seasoning with garlic, bay leaves, and red wine could cleverly disguise its slightly sweeter, iron-rich taste. Interestingly, newspapers of the time published editorials praising horse meat's nutritional value, hoping to encourage skeptical diners to saddle up and give it a try. However, public acceptance faded rapidly after World War II, as horses transitioned fully from livestock status to beloved pets, sparking a cultural backlash against consuming an animal more commonly pictured pulling carts or carrying cowboys into sunsets. Today, slaughtering horses for food is banned nationwide, driven by both ethical concerns and potential contamination from medications given to animals not raised for consumption. The FDA classifies horses as companion animals, effectively shutting the stable door on commercial sale of horse meat. Molasses, lard, bacon grease, these were the tools of the trade back then. Using them, people made all sorts of things like molasses porridge. Why was this something you wanted, especially over regular porridge? Well, it's simple. In the context of the economic crash out of the 1930s, milk was simply too much for people to afford regularly, and at the exact same time, porridge was something that people needed to eat every day. Molasses porridge was a very cheap dish that could make a big meal out of a small amount of ingredients. It was exactly the kind of thing you would need for a family back in those times, especially when so many families began to live together for fear of running out of resources too quickly. This was especially true for people who had elderly families. Molasses porridge was something that was seen in New England in their rural communities more than anywhere else. The reason porridge helped so much was because you could also add all kinds of scraps, leftovers, and dried fruit to it so that you could make it better. People would also add in stuff like lime, cinnamon, or nutmeg if they wanted to, and that would often make it better. Rendered fat soap kept families clean when store-bought bars cost money needed for food and rent. The process began by saving every scrap of animal fat from cooking: bacon grease, beef tallow, pork lard, storing it in crocks until enough accumulated. The fat was melted slowly, strained through cheesecloth, then combined with lye water made from hardwood ashes soaked in rainwater. This mixture was stirred for hours until it thickened, then poured into wooden molds to harden over several days. The resulting soap was harsh but effective, cutting through dirt with efficiency that commercial products rarely matched. Some women added garden herbs for fragrance. Soap-making day became a community event, with women pooling resources and sharing labor. This hack transformed waste into cleanliness, proving that self-sufficiency was possible even when everything else seemed impossible for struggling families. Before neatly packaged pork chops arrived wrapped in cellophane at supermarkets, families in Depression-era America took matters and meat cleavers into their own hands. Home-slaughtered pigs without inspection weren't just rural tradition, they were economic necessity, a direct route from the backyard pig pen to dinner plates nationwide. Neighbors often gathered together, turning butchering day into a social event, perhaps the original farm-to-table movement, minus the trendy menus. Pork cuts were carefully salted, smoked, cured, or canned in cellars without official oversight, and sausages stuffed by hand provided protein all winter. Interestingly, nearly every part found a use, including rendering fat for lard or transforming scraps into sausage, a testament to Depression-era thriftiness. Yet these home-slaughtered practices carried hidden dangers. Unsupervised slaughter led to contamination risks, including trichinosis outbreaks and food poisoning incidents that pushed authorities toward regulation. Today, selling home-slaughtered pork without USDA inspection isn't just risky, It's illegal nationwide, intended to protect public health and ensure humane animal treatment standards. Peanut butter gravy on rice is a fantastic example of how inventive people were during the Depression. See, the thing about this is that peanut butter was one of the best things you could buy during the Depression for several reasons. If the constant use of lard didn't tip you off, people were really treasuring fat wherever they could find it. Secondly, people needed as much protein as they could afford to get or forage. Peanut butter was luckily proficiently loaded in both of these things, but on top of that, it was also pretty cheap. It was one of the best sources of protein and fat within that price range. You might wonder how they got a gravy going out of this, though. Well, you'd add some water or milk, usually water, and something to thicken the gravy with, like all-purpose flour. If people could spare it, just a bit of margarine for some more richness and basic seasonings were also really helpful. You'd get somewhat of a gravy going with this, and on rice it was filling enough. String-saving collections became obsessive practices in households where every scrap held potential value. Families kept dedicated balls of saved string, winding together pieces from packages, feed sacks, and gifts until balls grew larger than softballs. This accumulated string served countless purposes: tying packages, mending clothes, securing garden plants to stakes, creating toys for children, hanging laundry when lines broke. Some families organized string by thickness, keeping separate balls for different purposes. Children learned to untie knots carefully rather than cutting, preserving maximum length for future use. The string ball often hung near the kitchen door, always accessible when need arose. What might seem like compulsive hoarding was actually practical wisdom. Purchasing new string represented money that could buy food instead. The habit persisted long after the Depression ended. This hack trained minds to see value in what others discarded. Those hands went still a long time ago. If any of these meals brought someone back, tell us in the comments.